Lieu stepped into that chamber with the bearing of someone who had spent years in rooms where precision matters more than volume. He isn't just another lawmaker with a stack of talking points.
Patel, I'm going to ask you a very broad and general question. As you know, Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein were friends. There are, of course, photos showing Donald Trump together with Epstein, correct?
I don't have the entirety of the photographs, but I think they've been photographed in public together.
All right. Are there any photos showing Donald Trump with girls of an uncertain age?
No.
He's a former Air Force JAG officer who built a career parsing testimony, spotting gaps, and reading the space between words. Experience like that shapes how you listen, how you frame a question, and how quickly you sense when an answer drifts off course. So when he turned his attention to FBI Director Kash Patel, the atmosphere shifted from routine oversight to something more deliberate. You could feel that this wasn't going to be a standard round of polite exchanges and rehearsed lines. Lieu opened by identifying his background, not as a boast, but as context for how he evaluates testimony. Years of military legal work, he noted, teach you to recognize patterns in how people respond under pressure. Some witnesses hedge, some over-explain, some wander into side streets that never lead back to the question. He said in measured terms that certain behavioral patterns can raise professional curiosity, especially when clarity matters. It wasn't an accusation so much as an observation rooted in his training. Still, the message was clear. He was listening with a different set of tools. Patel tried to interject early, but Lieu calmly signaled he would proceed on his own timeline. He said he wasn't launching into questions just yet, only offering perspective from someone trained to assess credibility in high-stakes settings. The tone stayed formal, yet the subtext carried weight. This felt less like partisan sparring and more like structured examination. I've seen hearings that drift. This one tightened. Lieu appeared intent on controlling tempo, pacing, and sequence the way a seasoned litigator might. Instead of diving straight into the Epstein matter, he began with basic process questions about FBI workflow. Who compiles investigation files, who reviews them, and how do major cases move up the chain of command? Patel seemed more comfortable here, outlining standard procedures about field agents, escalation protocols, and leadership review. The exchange sounded technical, almost mundane. But sometimes the most ordinary groundwork sets the most consequential traps. Lieu confirmed that significant cases ultimately reach senior leadership for review. Patel agreed, explaining that important matters land at the directorate level. Lieu nodded, then asked whether the Epstein investigation qualified as important. Patel said it did. The logic chain was now in place, simple and easy to follow. So, Lieu asked, did the full Epstein file reach Patel's desk? Patel responded that portions and summaries were provided. Lieu returned to Patel's earlier phrasing about important files receiving direct review. The distinction between summaries and complete materials suddenly mattered. It wasn't dramatic, but it was precise. Lieu questioned whether summaries alone were sufficient for a case of such scale and public interest. His tone suggested concern about process rather than blame. Patel emphasized delegation and the realities of managing vast information flows. That explanation sounded familiar to anyone who has worked in large organizations. Yet Lieu's line of inquiry implied that scale and significance can change expectations. The conversation moved to a specific internal review date, and Patel said he didn't recall exact timelines. Lieu referenced documentation indicating an assessment had occurred and cited figures from an internal report. Cameras leaned in, not because of spectacle, but because numbers concentrate attention. Patel acknowledged that drafts existed while emphasizing that preliminary reports evolve. It was a careful response grounded in bureaucratic practice. Lieu read categories from the document, politicians, executives, media figures, and others, without naming individuals. He framed the discrepancy between internal categorization and public messaging as a question about process. How do early assessments translate into final conclusions? Patel said multi-stage verification can alter preliminary findings. That's standard, though it rarely satisfies public curiosity. Asked how many names appeared in the final version, Patel declined to provide figures publicly. Lieu interpreted the answer as confirmation that a number exists, even if undisclosed. The distinction between unknown and not shared hung in the air. It's a subtle difference, but one people notice. Language choices can carry as much meaning as disclosures. Liu then turned to staffing levels, asking how many agents worked the review. Patel estimated a small, specialized team. Liu compared that number with staffing levels in other historic investigations, suggesting differences in scale. Comparisons don't prove priorities, but they do prompt reflection. Patel replied that effectiveness isn't measured by headcount alone. The exchange shifted to whether investigators identified specific categories of individuals. Patel said names appear in various contexts but avoided characterizations that could imply conclusions. Liu emphasized that acknowledging mentions is different from assigning responsibility. The nuance mattered. Public audiences often collapse nuance into headlines, but the record preserves distinctions. At one point, Liu pressed for clarity about terminology, separating no-list meeting legal standards from no names exist. Patel maintained that prosecutorial thresholds guide how information is framed. It was a technical defense not uncommon in legal settings. Liu's posture suggested he wanted plainer language. The friction was about interpretation, not theatrics. Then came a pivot that caught the room off guard: Epstein's death. Patel reaffirmed the official finding while Liu referenced commentary from independent experts. He cited the existence of differing professional opinions without endorsing any single theory. The question became how external assessments are weighed. Patel said such opinions were reviewed and included in the file. Liu pressed on the difference between logging a document and actively evaluating its claims. Patel responded that reviews occurred and conclusions remained unchanged. It was a classic oversight moment: process versus perception. Liu enumerated a series of failures that have fueled public debate: malfunctioning equipment, staffing lapses, incomplete footage, framing them as concerns rather than verdicts. He asked whether simultaneous breakdowns seemed routine or extraordinary. Patel reiterated that the investigation followed established protocols. Liu observed that many inquiries conclude formally while leaving lingering public questions. It was less an indictment than a commentary on trust gaps. Closed can be a procedural term, he implied, not always an emotional one. People want resolution, not just paperwork. As the questioning neared its end, Liu requested a clear yes or no commitment about future disclosures. Patel said legal and privacy constraints limit what can be released. Liu pressed for simplicity, but Patel emphasized that some materials may remain restricted. The exchange crystallized the tension between openness and obligation. Neither side raised voices. The stakes spoke for themselves. Liu acknowledged the answer and reflected on what permanent restrictions mean for public understanding. He asked why certain materials must stay sealed and who those decisions ultimately serve. Patel did not expand further. Silence can be procedural, but it's rarely neutral in the court of public opinion. Viewers tend to fill gaps with their own narratives. Liu spoke about the victims and the human weight of unresolved questions, careful to avoid sensational language. He framed transparency as a component of accountability, not spectacle. The emphasis was on process integrity and public trust. Patel listened, expression steady. The moment felt heavy without being theatrical. Drawing on his military legal background, Liu described how structured questioning can reveal inconsistencies without presuming guilt. He said history evaluates testimony in context, over time with records as reference. It was a sober reminder that hearings become archives. Today's exchanges turn into tomorrow's footnotes. Accountability often unfolds slowly. By the close, the narrative wasn't about scoring points, but about competing expectations. Liu highlighted apparent mismatches between statements, documents, and procedures. Patel maintained institutional guardrails and legal constraints. Each position had logic, neither offered complete closure. The result was tension that lingered beyond the gavel. From my perspective, the exchange illustrated how oversight can sharpen public questions without delivering final answers. Liu's methodical approach contrasted with Patel's measured restraint. One sought clarity through compression, the other preserved caution through qualification. That dynamic defines many modern hearings. It's less courtroom drama than civic stress test. The takeaway isn't a verdict, but a set of unresolved threads. How much transparency satisfies democratic accountability? When do legal boundaries become communication barriers? Can institutions explain limits without deepening skepticism? Those questions persist regardless of party or personality. A touch of dry irony hovered over the scene. The simplest questions often meet the most complex answers. Washington runs on procedure while the public runs on clarity. Bridging that gap requires more than sound bites. It takes patient explanation and credible process. In the end, Ted Lieu didn't deliver accusations. He delivered a framework for scrutiny. Kash Patel didn't concede wrongdoing. He reinforced institutional limits. The space between those positions is where public debate lives. And debate, handled responsibly, is part of how democracies refine themselves. The record now holds the exchange, waiting for context, time, and continued oversight to do their work. What lingered after the microphones cooled wasn't a knockout moment or a viral soundbite, but a slow, persistent hum of unfinished business. The exchange had the texture of a process under strain, where procedure and public expectation tug in opposite directions. Lawmakers speak the language of oversight, agencies speak the language of compliance, and somewhere between those dialects, clarity can get lost. Watching it unfold felt less like a climax and more like a checkpoint in a longer institutional journey. Nothing exploded, yet nothing settled either. In the hours that followed, analysts replayed the sequence not for drama but for structure. They mapped how Ted Lieu built his line of questioning brick by brick, starting with process, then scope, then disclosure. It resembled a legal outline more than a political monologue. Kash Patel's responses mirrored a different discipline, one shaped by chain-of-command realities and the constraints of classified environments. If Liu was constructing a narrative arc, Patel was reinforcing guardrails. That contrast is common in oversight settings, but it becomes magnified when the subject carries years of public attention. The Epstein case isn't just a file, it's a symbol for unresolved curiosity and institutional trust. Every reference to it carries historical weight. Even routine clarifications feel consequential. That doesn't make every inference correct, but it does explain the intensity. Liu's approach suggested that precision can be more persuasive than volume. He rarely strayed into rhetorical flourish, choosing instead to pin down definitions and timelines. When he asked whether summaries differ from full files, he wasn't chasing spectacle, he was probing standards. In large organizations, summaries are practical necessities, yet for matters of exceptional significance, people expect exceptional thoroughness. Patel's defense rested on the realities of scale and delegation. No director personally reads every page of every major case, and leadership depends on structured briefings. That's not evasive, it's operational. But the public often measures diligence by proximity to details. The gap between operational efficiency and symbolic accountability can be hard to bridge. Another thread that surfaced was the distinction between preliminary assessments and final determinations. Drafts exist to be refined, and early categorizations can shift as verification proceeds. Liu highlighted how early figures can shape perception even if they later change. Patel emphasized that process matters more than snapshots. Both points can be true at once. The conversation about staffing levels touched a nerve for a different reason. Numbers invite comparison, and comparison invites judgment. Referencing other investigations with larger teams creates an intuitive contrast, even if missions differ. Patel's point about quality over quantity reflects internal realities. Liu's point about optics reflects external expectations. Then there's the language of mention versus implication, a subtle but crucial divide. Names appearing in documents doesn't automatically establish roles or responsibility. Legal standards demand careful framing. Liu's insistence on clarity aimed to prevent semantic fog. Patel's caution aimed to avoid premature characterizations. When the topic shifted to Epstein's death, the room seemed to tighten again. Official findings carry institutional authority, yet independent perspectives remain part of the public discourse. Lieu framed the issue as a question of evaluation, not verdict. Patel responded within the bounds of established conclusions. The exchange underscored how differing expert views can coexist without easy resolution. Listing a series of procedural failures, equipment issues, staffing lapses, incomplete recordings, Liu framed them as compounding concerns. He didn't assert causation, he asked about probability and protocol. Patel reiterated that the investigation adhered to standards and reached its determination. It was a conversation about confidence levels, not certainties. A recurring theme was the word complete. In bureaucratic terms, it signals the end of a formal process. In public terms, it can sound like closure. Those meanings don't always align. Liu's commentary suggested that procedural completion doesn't automatically satisfy civic curiosity. Patel's stance suggested that processes must conclude based on evidence thresholds. Asking for a yes or no commitment on future disclosures brought the tension into sharp relief. Patel acknowledged legal and privacy constraints that limit transparency. Liu pressed for simplicity, reflecting the public's desire for definitive commitments. The outcome, some materials may remain restricted, felt predictable yet heavy. Permanence changes the emotional register. Why must certain materials stay sealed? The reasons can be mundane: privacy laws, protection of victims, national security considerations. Yet the absence of specifics invites speculation. Institutions often err on the side of caution, but caution can resemble opacity from the outside. Explaining the why becomes as important as the what. Liu's emphasis on victims reframed the discussion from paperwork to people. He spoke about accountability not as punishment but as recognition and transparency. The tone stayed measured, avoiding sensationalism. Patel listened without interruption. The moment felt grounded in responsibility rather than rivalry. When Liu invoked his military legal experience, it served as context for his method, not as a credential flex. Structured questioning, he suggested, is a tool for clarity. Records matter because memory fades and narratives shift. Today's transcript becomes tomorrow's reference point. Oversight is cumulative. By the end, neither side had delivered a cinematic finale. Instead, they left a layered record reflecting competing priorities. Liu highlighted apparent mismatches and sought plainer language. Patel reinforced institutional constraints and legal boundaries. The friction between those positions is inherent to democratic governance. Observers often crave decisive outcomes, but oversight rarely works that way. It's iterative, built across sessions and documents and follow-ups. One hearing surfaces questions, another refines them. Progress can look incremental even when stakes feel immense. Patience becomes part of accountability. There's also a media dynamic at play. Short clips amplify tone while full transcripts preserve nuance. A pause can trend. A paragraph can disappear. That asymmetry shapes perception. Responsible viewers learn to read beyond highlights. In my view, the exchange illustrated how trust is negotiated, not declared. Institutions ask for patience, the public asks for clarity. Lawmakers translate civic concerns into formal questions. Officials translate procedural limits into guarded answers. The space between translations is where skepticism grows or recedes. Transparency isn't absolute, and secrecy isn't inherently sinister. The challenge is explaining limits without sounding dismissive. People can accept boundaries when reasons feel credible. Vague language, even when legally prudent, can erode confidence. Communication strategy matters as much as policy. The hearing also reflected generational shifts in expectations. Digital culture prizes immediacy and access. Government processes prioritize verification and risk mitigation. Reconciling those tempos requires better civic literacy and better institutional storytelling. Otherwise, misunderstandings multiply. What happens next matters more than what already happened. Will there be follow-up sessions clarifying methodologies and review standards? Will documentation be summarized in ways that respect both privacy and public interest? Oversight thrives on continuity. Transparency thrives on explanation. I'm cautious about drawing sweeping conclusions from a single exchange, yet I recognize why it resonated. It showcased a disciplined inquiry and a disciplined defense. It spotlighted the mechanics of accountability without theatrics, and it reminded viewers that governance is a process, not a performance. If institutions want durable trust, they must show their work whenever possible. If lawmakers want constructive oversight, they must press firmly without presuming outcomes. That balance is delicate but achievable. It requires mutual respect and relentless focus on process integrity. Ultimately, the hearing left us with informed questions rather than final answers. How are classification decisions reviewed over time? What standards govern public disclosures in sensitive cases? How do agencies communicate constraints without alienating citizens? These are structural questions worth asking. Ted Lieu's method suggested that careful sequencing can illuminate complexity. Kash Patel's posture suggested that careful boundaries protect legal obligations. Neither stance cancels the other. Together they form the push and pull that defines institutional oversight. And maybe that's the most honest takeaway. Democracy advances through friction managed responsibly. Not every tension signals crisis. Sometimes it signals engagement. The goal isn't spectacle, it's clarity earned through persistence. The record now carries another chapter, waiting for context and continuity to complete the picture.